Hello. Thanks for having me. I gave an earlier version of this talk when I was in DC, and I got like a bunch of shit from a bunch of enterprise architects, so I tried to make a good version of this. Because, I don't like to get that. I like to be loved. But this is a little talk. I've been flitting around and, I guess, thought leadering. I don't really know if that's appropriate in this space and others for a while. And one of the things I've noticed a lot is that, I'm going to try not to curse too much, so I'm sorry about that. One of the things I've noticed is enterprise architects are not in a good situation. They're not like doing well, and I don't think that's a phrase we even use at these conferences or people who know what a Kubernetes is or any of this stuff. It's basically like enterprise architects are not involved, which is too bad, because they usually know what's going on, more or less. And they're also in that role of like, if they get fired, like it's hard for them to get a new job. At usually, tragically, the age they're at and their knowledge of XML and XPath and stuff. This again, I'm trying to be optimistic about how we can rethink enterprise architecture in here. And also, they're a terrible barrier for our sales process, so I need to figure out how to get over that. So first of all, I always like to thank people for having me at a DevOps Days. I really like DevOps Days stuff, and this building is wonderful. And man, that internet is awesome. Look at that. I get 12 megadoodles at home, so like it's going to take me like 5 years to upload all my videos to Google Photos. So I think I'm going to put a real dent in it today, which is really the reason why I'm here. So as a brief introduction to myself, you can go look up what the deal with me is up there on the URL. But as mentioned, I work at Pivotal with Paul. It's wonderful. We're both in Austin. We went and got rotating sushi. We need to go somewhere new, so I got more jokes about that. But I've been there for about 3 years now, which is great. It's a really nice place to work. We have good software, blah, all that stuff. We got a table. You can come have us hustle you and give you free books. I also was an analyst at RedMonk for a while, another place called 451 Research, and living in Austin, I had to have a 2-year compulsory tour at Dell, so I did corporate strategy and M&A. I don't know if you've ever worked with MBAs, but that's an experience. Like, I think maybe it's a little better than dealing with DBAs and network admins, but probably better, maybe worse than security people. I don't really know. But yeah, they're fun, and they actually drive Porsche Carreras, which I was not expecting. I also have a podcast called Software Defined Talk and some other stuff, if you're interested in that. And I write more or less a monthly column at the Register. So if you can stand people who don't know how to spell virtualization in color, you can check that out. And you can go read the comments for me so I don't go shoot myself after I post something. So first, a disclaimer. I don't actually know anything about enterprise architecture. I read a UML book back when I was programming, and I used to draw it. And I've used rational rows, too, which I thought was awesome. I think, again, what I'm trying to go for in my own corny way with my straw people and my exaggerations and everything is, let's construct a false straw person here so we can explore how enterprise architects can help out and how they can make sure to get involved in this. And equally importantly, as I always like the, it's not me, it's you sort of thing we heard this morning, right? Oftentimes it's the person asking the question who's kind of the jerk. I'm trying to speak nicely here. But similarly, I think it's good to realize what enterprise architects can do for us and why they're necessary and start to pull them in more. So, if you've seen other talks that I give, the world is changing and IT people, business people want to do computer stuff better and they want to transform and do digital transformation. So you can go look up more on that. So let's go over the problem that enterprise architects pose at first. And it's the similar problems that you see in pretty much every organization that you would talk about at a DevOps Days, right? And the issue is one of like the largesse of success that these organizations have, right? They've been set up for a long time, things run really well, you've got your leadership, and you've got the management in the middle, and I don't really know what to call it, so I put FTE down there. But you have an organization set up that is very optimized and is sort of profit-reaping. They've got like a help desk, they're helping ServiceNow increase their quarter-over-quarter growth, all that kind of stuff. But they're not really built to change, right? They're kind of an immutable organization in that sense of they are organized around their past success and their present success to that extent. So I think each of these layers has some culpability in a company not being successful. And our friend in the middle gets a lot of the crap for not changing, right? Because usually leadership is all like, we're going to do the Agile and the DevOps, and we're going to install a Kubernetes and do some design, and we're going to give everyone free breakfast, and then bam, it's going to work out well, and I'll see you later next year when we transform again. But they are a little bit more genuine about what they're doing, and they certainly are interested in budgeting and changing things around. And our enterprise architect friends, they're somewhere there in the middle, right? And they start to be some of the most intractable people to deal with. And trying to be, I think in the DevOps world, you're supposed to be empathetic. I'm not really sure what that is, but it sounds cool. And hopefully you can read that slide over there. If you want to get a copy of these slides, I had to use a speaker deck for the first time because SlideShare, their DevOps people must be here attending, but it's not working. But if you go to my Twitter thing, twitter.com, if you're aware of that, /Cotè, you can download these slides, which unfortunately are PDF instead of a PowerPoint because GitHub doesn't know what PowerPoint is. But there's a great book that I started reading that's ancient by our standards. I think it was written in the late 90s. And it really has this wonderful slide over here. Like I was kind of talking about how the problems we have today are due to the successes we had in the past. And I think these mentalities are a lot of, when I've talked with enterprise architects who are not, let's say, enlightened, a lot of it comes from this, is they were in this virtuous, which becomes a vicious cycle of everything was working out well. We put a lot of governance and whatever a service bus or an ESB is in place, and this is wonderful. Things are going well, so why would we change it? And by sort of ignoring change, things cycle through and reinforce each other. And also, you have the effect of, people would call it a brain drain, but all of your mavericky people who want to innovate end up leaving. And then you're sort of left with the people who are happy about things, which, just a little pro tip, whenever you see a company in distress, and then a few years later they talk about employee morale being up, that's probably because they laid off a bunch of people with really sweet packages, right? You sort of like weed out all the people. And then you also end up with just a human nature thing, right? Of like, who wants to change? It seems exhausting, right? Like, you want to basically transmogrify any sort of new way of improvement or anything that's work back to what you already existingly do, which I think is why like low-carb diets are so popular, right? It's like, I already eat a lot of meat and crazy stuff and bacon, so this must be an awesome diet. I'm going to stick to it. It's got some science behind it. So again, the point is, like, people don't want to suck at their job, but they get stuck in this situation that reinforces them not changing. And that's not always a big deal, but if you remember back to a slide with the GM CEO, right? Like, there actually is this moment in time where change is actually required and is very important across all businesses, right? It's not just because of, like, millennials or whatever and their kombucha, but it's like there actually are new things that can be done and new ways of competing that require actual good software and actual good IT that's coming down there. So, to that point, this is a slide from my friend. It's pretty old now, but my friend at Allstate, Matt Curry. And it's well worth, I know you can't click on that right now, but if you're interested, it's well worth going and looking at how leadership needs to change things along. And this is a little bit of the enterprise architecture part that he gets to, right? And that is a lot of where enterprise architecture is nowadays is it's become this paddle boat, right? Like, when you were first starting out, and I think this company, like, if you go look at their Wikipedia page, you can see, I guess they're probably not on a paddle boat. You never want to insult the people who you're standing in their room. But they started off doing a lot of interesting new things. They're speedboats. They built out a fleet, acquired some companies. And if it were another company who didn't have their nice, as everyone tells me, UN-style seating up there, like, what usually ends up happening is you have this paddle boat here, right? So you had a speedboat. You were very agile. And then you went to kind of like a pontoon boat so you could have, like, more people on there. You got to move a little slower, but you do have that cooler full of your beverages. You can have some grilling out there. Everything's nice. And then all of a sudden you end up with this, right? Like, you've got your policies, your committees, your change review boards, all the stuff that's making sure that this massive boat is moving well. And I think if you're like me, this is sort of like kind of like analogous to like the corporate parties that you go to. That's like, woo, we're gonna have a booze cruise, and then you're 30 minutes into it and you've like maybe drank a little too much because it's free, and you're like, holy crap, there's 3 more hours of this and I'm stuck, right? And that's where a lot of people are when it comes to their enterprise architecture and their change in general. So the goal is, let's figure out not exactly turning ourselves into a paddle boat. Because what you see is, the result of a lot of cloud stuff and DevOpsy things and all of that is the development teams, as always, if you remember the old wall of confusion, right, where they're just like scrumming their brains out, building up a wonderful inventory of releases that operations people don't want to deploy, right? Sort of like, good job not reading your gold rat, congratulations. But anyhow, this actually is happening at a lot more rapid pace, and you see organizations essentially piling up these builds. And usually what ends up happening, so this guy is from, if you have health insurance, you probably know Blue Cross Blue Shield, and HCSC owns about 5 different states' Blue Cross Blue Shields. So they've been, piling up the builds. And essentially, because the business side actually wants software that's not terrible, they basically just say, like, well, maybe we won't go through all those processes, right? And to that point, I mean, it's true. Like, if you're releasing multiple times a week, like, it's going to take you a few weeks just to, like, schedule the enterprise architects to review something, right? Because they're probably senior enough that, they're on vacation, and then they cancel meetings and all that kind of stuff. And they've got a lot of other work to do. So something has to happen with this process so that we can speed it up and so that we're not holding back all of these, as simple as it is, releases that are going on. So, a lot of what you would think about, we start with enterprise architecture, right? Like, we still need this enterprise architecture unless we're one of those tiny companies that are out there that probably doesn't need enterprise architecture. They're probably not even there must be some auto transition there. They're probably not even an enterprise. And so to kind of give you an idea of what an enterprise is, this is an example from Comcast. And this is I forget what ESP stands for. Oh, it's right there. I should know that. But this is basically all of the system that they have to run the money side of cable subscriptions, right? So if you look through there's some like CRM stuff, some phone call stuff, doing sales, collection, all this kind of stuff, right? So it's a core business that they have, and you can see the impressive speeds and feeds there, right? So you probably need at least one person to kind of look over that and make sure that it's working well. Like, that would be cool if they could make money as a company, which is fine, right? So you have that function. But then, it's good to imagine that, like, well, what if we have like 6 of these? Like, we're a bigger company. And then what if we have this many of these that we have to manage, right? We've got all these different applications and services. And at that point, this is maybe, you're trying to stick a motor on a paddle boat, and there probably is someone other than all the little teams that are like doing their microservices nonsense in each of those black silos, that you want to coordinate that and make sure that you're actually like following business ideas. Like, I was just talking with someone who mentioned the word HIPAA, and then you also over there in EU land, you got some other privacy stuff because they like care about you not being scammed and losing all your stuff. But there's all sorts of regulations and rules, not only that you need to make sure that you have for compliance, but just straight up, a portfolio like this is like madness to like manage in some sort of like bottoms-up mentality. On the other hand, like, you don't want to end up with that paddle boat thing where you are sort of like managing all of this to a grinding halt. So clearly, like, you need some function that has this big picture view of things. And it's easy to think, especially like, I think this is a good sort of, this talk this morning went over, this is like, well, we're just gonna like barbarian the crap out of this. We're gonna be a bunch of like, I was reminding myself I should go read up on whatever the Spotify method is before I make fun of it, but never mind that. We're gonna have all these like tribes of people who are just like hoarding over the mountains and taking over the land. And I don't know about you, but it seems like pretty much, other than Genghis Khan, every barbarian invasion ends in lots of terribleness, right? Like, they don't really know how to run systems. I always like the Genghis Khan method, which is kind of like the private equity method, which is, we take over, your land or your country, and we slaughter the nobles or the executives, and then you love us, right? Like, that's it. You can do whatever you want as long as you deliver your taxes. It's a really good system for transformation. But obviously, you need to do more than have this mentality of sending a bunch of marauders in who like change things and break stuff really quickly. So, if that sells you of the notion that one, people need to change how they're doing things. Classic enterprise architecture isn't necessarily working out because it's the slow sort of paddle boat affair that you have. And yet, we do need to have some sort of enterprise architecture. You could probably come up with some other phrase for it. Like, there's some other people at Allstate who I talked with a little while ago, and they're building out, they're doing all the DevOps and SRE and platformy stuff. And I was talking with them a while about building out that function that they have so that their developers can self-service deploy and work weekly and do all the great stuff that we like, resulting in better software and making sure you get your money if you get run into. And after a while talking with them, I said oh, you're like enterprise architects. And they were like, no, don't repeat that to anyone ever again, right? Like we don't want anyone to call us that. That's terrible. So if anyone has a new phrase for it, that'd be great. You could come up with it and then people won't be embarrassed. But to that end, let's look at a few things that I think, to a lesser extent the organization, but EA types probably would do well to kind of go through to get to steal a title from a book I'll reference later, a seat at the table, or at least at the kids' table. It's usually their CIO who goes to the big table. But there's a few things that I've noticed emerging over the past few years that are good for EAs to do, and also EA-like functions that need to be happening in organizations. So apologies for this. I didn't have time to make some fancy art or find anything, so look at my beautiful handwriting. I even tried to shade in the arrows there, which I hope you appreciate that. Anyways, I think there's a mindset change that many of the EAs I talk with need to go through. And that is sort of being cognizant of this cycle that we have in most anything, but in particular in IT, and being aware that it's okay to swap between these two things. And indeed, that's the whole point, right? And so on the one hand, I think it's not so much a chicken and egg problem, right? Like when you're starting out a new venture or a business, or if you're in a nonprofit government thing, like a new thing, you're building from the ground up. You have this process of discovery and growth. You're trying to figure out what you're doing and build it up and explore and grow it out. And if you're like a lot of companies, you're not so concerned with optimizing and profit, right? Because you want to build the floor, the foundation of what you have. And as you figure that out and you get more knowledge of it, you switch over more to the sort of as-is state, the running the business. And that's where you sort of start to get to the paddle boat where you're we know exactly how to do this. We have the software to do it. Now what we need to do is focus on, as they would say, our bottom line and increase, grow the market that we're selling to, and also grow the profit that we're taking from it. And our job is essentially to not screw it up. And so we're going to spend a lot of our time not screwing it up. And that's where I think a lot of traditional enterprise architecture comes from, is not really screwing it up. But again, nowadays, there's a pull to not so much not know what you're doing, but businesses want to do new things, and organizations want to do newer things. So EAs need to have this mentality of moving back to this discovery and growth mentality of doing things, where they're not so much worried about protecting what's there as figuring out new ways that they're doing things. Now, in a classical DevOps days thing, I would have the Deming quote up here about good luck surviving, I'm not going to help you if you don't agree with me, sort of thing. But hopefully this is a slightly nicer version of it. But I think once the EA starts shifting to that mentality, they can kind of get over a lot of the issues and the blockers that they tend to have. Now, as an example, and of all places, the Air Force, there's some great cases and coverage of the Air Force thinking like this. But one of the things that I think is a good tell for EAs who can't switch over to this way of thinking, and organizations as a whole, is if you still have these giant, ponderous, three-ring binders of requirements and this big upfront knowledge of what's going to happen and how it's going to pan out. And I guess maybe if you're implementing some law that Congress passed, then you're just kind of screwed, and you have a three-ring binder that you have to implement. But for most people, you have the ability to kind of explore out and figure out what's happening in this business that you're doing and change things around. There's another insurance company that was selling into the Australian motorcycle insurance business, and they had never sold into that market before. And so they had this ability to very iteratively figure out what that looks like and the best way to sell it. They didn't necessarily have to write a gigantic document, and 2 years later they could start selling insurance there and hope that they got it right the first time. So if you see your EAs, or you're an EA yourself, sort of putting out these giant documents, there's probably something a little fishy going on, right? And of course, Post-it notes are the salvation that you want to look for, right? And whenever there's Post-it notes involved, all your problems are solved. You can start going home at 5 and things will be perfect. But kidding aside, that is an interesting, again, another tell that you have. And you don't want to get too cargo culty, to reference back again about it, but probably your ratio to post-it notes and like big Word docs that are emailed around and break your attachment quotas is a good thing to track as far as how you're doing. So next, just to take a little smart art break, I'm really good at PowerPoint, so I like to explore the smart art every now and then. It looks nice. But I've been seeing this kind of like stack emerge in organizations, especially large ones. And you know, there's always stacks, but I think this one in particular is good for an enterprise architect to start paying attention to, because like I don't know who else is going to pay attention to it, right? Like each individual team, if you let them run off on their own, is, you know, you throw some DevOps reports at them and educate them about the Prussian military and all this sorts of like nonsense that we got in the literature, you know, nonsense in a good way. And they're probably going to implement like 3 different ways of doing this stack within their own team before they settle on one. And if you can imagine like a large company like JP Morgan Chase, who has, depending on what source you're looking at, anywhere between 19,000 and 20,000 developers working for them, right? Like, let's be favorable and say that represents, I can't do math because I have a philosophy degree, but like, let's say that represents maybe like 2,000 applications, right? Like, you're probably going to want to get some optimization of how you consolidate the practices down there. So, again, I think an enterprise architect is a good person to start exploring and discovering and then putting in place what this stack is. And on top, you have the processes that you're following, right? And a lot of the, you know, once all the tooling stuff got sorted out in the late 2000s in the DevOps world, we switched all over to this culture stuff, right? Like, what's the process that we're following, or are we doing agile? And do we like celebrate catastrophic failure and like give those people nice hoodies and everything? Like all of the stuff that you would do in a DevOps environment. So someone needs to figure out at scale, should we all be doing the same thing? I mean, probably. And what would that thing be, and how do we evolve that thing? What is our process for following these things? And then underneath that, if you've read sort of the sort of like bludgeoning that someone like a Gary Gruber does about how a pipeline or a build pipeline or your CI/CD is actually one of the most important things that you have. That's another thing that seems to kind of like fall on the floor, right? Like as Paul was joking about this morning, right? You don't just put that butler guy in there and your problems are solved, right? Like building your pipeline is a core asset that you have in your organization, and maintaining it, and so much of what you're going to get is going to be a benefit of that, hence me highlighting it here. And again, when you think of that gigantic like slide of doom of the Comcast thing that I just cut it and pasted, and there's some stuff in PowerPoint I can show you about how you can align it out perfectly so it looks really cool. But you're going to need someone to come up with and garden that pipeline for you, right? You don't want all these people like doing their different things, having their various CIs in there. And that's going to be a service that someone is providing. Now next, this is where I'm extremely biased, so you can take that with a grain of salt or whatever y'all use around here, maybe with some of that tasty cheese you have in the airport. But anyhow, you're probably going to want a platform, which is a way of saying, what is the thing that runs our application? How do we package and deploy things to it? How do we manage it on, you know, day 2 and day 3 and all of that? What's the thing beyond that wall of confusion that everything runs on, that allows us to have the efficiency of deploying every week? And hopefully it's not just like, you know, vSphere or AWS as our platform, but there's actually some structure on top of it and some way of driving, here is the way that we code things and here's the way that we operate things. And again, thinking about at scale, you probably don't want to have like 2,000 of those. It might be nice to have 50, right? Like, or I mean, if you have one, then you're super lucky. But you do want to consolidate down to something there. And again, like who's gonna manage this? Like the CIO is not gonna do it. They're too, you know, busy hanging out with their haha business friends, trying to get a better, you know, promotion and everything. But anyways, someone needs to keep their eye on this ball. Now, as another sort of indicator of how to check in on if that's doing well, I mean, if this is one of my favorite slides, right? But when it comes to process, for example, someone like an EA, and hopefully I've met some charming people in office of the PMO and things like that, which I realize is redundant, but there are the people who drive process and the way that we're doing things. But, you know, it's good to have an EA function or those people actually go around and kind of survey, like, are we actually agile? Because you know, there's a few government organizations I talk with who are like gleefully waterfall process, which is great for them. But most everyone says that they're doing Agile stuff. But this is a good example of why an overseer like an EA person is required. Is you look at these surveys, and if you kind of read through this, people don't actually follow the practices of Agile as widely as you would think, right? So someone needs to go in and make sure that you don't just have a bunch of certifications and books on their bookshelf, but that people are actually following these practices. And then the other part of the process, I think, is when you look at, as we apply this at scale, right? As we're going between innovating things and sort of like the run the business side of things, I don't want to make anyone have to go change their pants by saying the word bimodal or anything. But at some point, you're going to have to figure out, how do we integrate these multiple streams we have together? How do we coordinate experimenting with new ways of doing things, driving little successes of that business, scaling it up to other teams and products that we have, and then integrating it back to kind of like the mainline business that we have. I think there's been multiple conversations I've had even this morning where people would say, oh yeah, we're running most of this business on a .NET application that we can never change, right? Because it runs perfectly. And so at some point, someone needs to figure out, at the bottom, when you can change your .NET application, or what you do with it. Or maybe you do some facade, or I think we call that a strangler nowadays. But you do some way of merging it over. And again, company-wide, that seems like something that an enterprise architect would be all over and be very helpful with. And there's a great talk from FedEx kind of going over how they've been sorting this out at, I would say, sort of like an EA kind of level. And then, there's microservices and all of that, which someone should figure that out. So next, I think I should work on that one. It's supposed to be like an automatic laugh, but there's fresh coffee in the back. Anyways, the other thing that I think becomes apparent if you look at the platform layer is the role of EAs becomes a lot more than just writing that enterprise architecture diagram, right? And their enterprise architecture diagrams are awesome. If you saw, let me go back, if you saw Conan's enterprise architecture here, this is actually, I don't know if I can zoom in PowerPoint, but this is a wonderful one. It's from the 2000s, and it's Delta Airlines enterprise architecture at the time. And you read through it, and you can reverse engineer the entire business from it and how things interact. So those diagrams are great, right? And they're very helpful. But more and more what happens is, just having that diagram doesn't really do very much for you. And there's also the notion that things get stale and things don't actually operate very well. And so again, at a large scale, what you end up seeing is that the organization starts to consolidate down at the platform layer, right? So not only the way that they run things and configure it and package it, in all stages, dev, QA, staging, and production, if you still have all of those stages. But it also contains what you might call the business services that people are using, right? Every business has its own unique things that they need to do, right? Going back to the airline thing, they've got to book tickets and figure out who gets upgraded or not, which is some code I'd like to go in and modify. But they all have these unique things that are used across the organization, and that starts to be baked into the shared platform, which I know, sounds a lot like SOA, but it's okay. It'll be okay. We'll figure it out. Hopefully we've learned that lesson before all of us who live through that will retire. But you start putting that all in a centralized platform, and that means that you can manage it, you can evolve it, and you start to realize that what you're providing, what that enterprise architecture is actually a product that you're shipping, right? And then you can sort of take on this mentality, and you can kind of, as I jokingly say, DevOps the DevOps, right? You can think about what services do we need to provide? How do we need to do this? Who are the customers that we could talk to? And they're the developers, the product teams you have. And you switch over the way that you run this platform to a product, right? So you're not forcing people to use something, you're actually serving them, right? And you're continually gathering and product managing that. And I think this area, for as much as we might bag on SRE think for it being that's nice that the advertising people have their funny little method of doing stuff. But this is where the mentality, there's lots of things to take from SRE, but they have this interesting take it or leave it mentality of, if you use our platform, we will negotiate with you and guarantee some reliability. You don't have to use our platform, but then I'm not going to deal with your problems, right? And so you can see that there is this very customer-driven mentality that they have for it. They don't force you to do something. They're just trying to provide the best platform possible. And then that leads to, I think, a very DevOps sort of thing. I don't know if DevOps people ever actually made developers carry pagers. That's like a fun story that I think we tell each other. I'm sure it happens every now and then, but I don't think it's, anyways, we can talk about that later. But you could envision if an EA becomes the product manager, the owner for this platform, they've actually implemented the enterprise diagram. It's a product that then they take on this role of metaphorically carrying a pager, right? In the same way that you own your application and you're responsible for it end to end, the enterprise architect should be responsible for the platform, for the services that they're providing as well. I mean, otherwise they don't have that like Talabian skin in the game, and you know how that goes, right? Like people just pontificate and say things and then leave. They go join their haircutted friend there on their annual retreats to figure out the strategy for next year. After they close FY 2019 budgeting, always exciting. It's very confusing that they're always talking about the year ahead of time. So finally, to try to be a little hopeful, like I said, I'm trying to not be so cynical about everything in this talk. There's a great book that I referenced a little earlier. This guy, Mark Schwartz, like he only writes good books. Now, he's only written 2, so maybe the third one will be terrible. But he's got a good section on this book about what enterprise architects are and how we should think about it. And I think he's got a really good positioning, and it builds on first, as I was talking about earlier, enterprise architects actually usually know a whole lot. They've been there a long time. They know the history of things that have worked and didn't work. They know what teams and which people are like real go-getters and mavericks and are curious, and they know who you should like assign to take care of that .NET application on the other hand. Like they know who all the people are in the groups and the politics of running things. So they are this huge asset, almost like a Sherpa of what's going on IT-wise, right? So they have that knowledge to draw on. And, you know, they're usually like pretty smart and knowledgeable. I mean, there is like the Peter principle you could apply here, right? Which is a good moment of Western Zen of, if you don't know what that is, it's that people tend to get promoted to their level of incompetence, which is, it sort of makes logical sense that like, once you're in a job that you do poorly at, you will not get promoted. So you will stick at that job. Although I try to think that I've had the same job for a while and it's just because I like it, but maybe I'll go cry in a corner a little bit. Anyways, so the EA has lots of knowledge, and instead what they need to start thinking about, and what the business side and the CIO and us developers need to think about, is they're building this huge asset for the company, the enterprise architecture, right? They're building the machine that they have. In the same way that we might be excited about like whatever funny name thing like Google has, like their asset of things, or whatever the Netflixes have, or whatever company whose IT we admire, what system that they have to run things. That's a massive asset that they have. It'd be interesting to go look if they carry that as an asset on their balance sheet. But that is something that those companies treasure and they really take care of. And in that same way, that's what an enterprise architecture should be. It should be well-guarded and well-groomed for. And then hopefully that means that, you know, EAs are well-positioned and their jobs are more exciting. You know, there's only so much right-clicking you can do to generate your UML code. So with that, thanks for having me. I'm a little bit over here. Like I said, if you want to get these slides or check out more things, I have it posted a couple back on my Twitter account. And I'm over with Paul at the table there. If you want to hear about how you can give us way too much money to like help you do this type of thing with great results. My friend up here knows that. But anyways, we can go over how we help people out with this and all sorts of nonsense. And as another thing, I think there was this dark spell where they had lowered the referral bonus to like $2,000, but now I think it's back up to $3,500. So if you want to come work with us, that would be great. You just put my name down, but I'll tell you about working there, and then I can buy some spare Apple pencils or something. So again, thanks for having me, and hopefully I'll see y'all around later today.